if I had to put a dollar value on the impact that ArcSite has had on my business, it's like how many trips to, an hour away have I saved? How many estimates, how many projects have I won by having that more professional proposal? How many bullets have I dodged by, providing such a high level of detail? If I had to put a dollar amount on the value that ArcSite has provided to me in the almost 5 years that I've been using it, it's pretty priceless.
Dan, let's start off nice and easy. Can you just introduce yourself with your name and your title?
Yeah, my name is Dan Hardy. I own Hardy Fence out of Chanute, Kansas. And we're about a month away, not even a month away from being in business for 10 years. And we are a very small operation, family owned and operated. And
yeah, I guess tell me a little bit more about the business. How did you guys get started and what made you want to become an entrepreneur and start up this enterprise in the first place?
We decided to start this company out of necessity. Actually, we had a fire. Our barn burnt down, and I used to be in oil and gas for about 10 years in sales, and it was in early 2016, and the oil and gas industry was in kind of a downturn at the time, and I got laid off, and the barn had just burned down a few months prior, and we were having our new barn built in a different location, and while being laid off, thinking what's next? I don't want to just dive back into the oil field and just repeat this cycle. And so my wife and I were actually building some fence over from where the barn used to be to where the new barn was going to be. And we started joking around with the contractors that were building the barn, and they said, well, why don't you start a fence company? And it just that evening, I started doing some research on the market and what that would look like. And then 2 weeks later, we started the LLC, and early on, we found some industry experts, a little bit outside of our area to lean on for expertise and advice. And that was a huge step in the right direction early on, which led us to join the AFA, the American Fence Association, and things like that. And we've developed a lot of good relationships through that. But that's really how it started. And I guess, what put it in my heart to want to do something like that is my grandpa had a construction business here back in the 60s and 70s through the 80s. And he died when I was pretty little, so I never got to meet him. But I always thought when I was a kid, I want to grow up and be a carpenter like him. And then I get in the oil field and then have a desk job. And it's like, I'm so far away from, my childhood dream at this point that, how am I ever going to get out of it? And so being laid off, finally gave that opportunity to step out, in faith and bet on myself for a change. And it's been really good.
Absolutely. I mean, I think, obviously in the moment when, layoffs happen or like big life changes happen, it's like a huge blow because you're like, wait, this was my livelihood. What am I going to do now? But whether that's like by design, the universe has an intention and, it's kind of redirecting you in a way that, is maybe more of a fit for like what you dreamed that you wanted to do, like you were saying. So talk to me about the business as it stands today. How many, employees do you have? How big is the business? Just run me through it.
So when we first started, it was about 3 years until we hired our first employee. We started in March of 16, and then we hired our first employee in May of 19. And then when COVID hit, he ended up leaving. We hired another, and then toward the end of that year, hired another. And at that point, we outgrew the shop that we started in at home, and decided to move the business into town. For one, to get us off the gravel roads and go to job sites and everything's dusty on the trailer and that's not always good. But, so we found a commercial property in town and hired a few more people, and then an office manager and a marketing director, and then honestly, I got a little too comfortable and complacent, and I kind of let our culture fall apart, and slowly saw that, the mistakes be compounded, and kind of had to start over in a lot of ways, my faith is very important to me, and I just felt like God was leading us in a different direction, and so we actually ended up selling our commercial property, and actually we sold everything in that county and bought some land, and built a house. And this is kind of a fast forward to 2024. Just a series of bad hires and mistakes, and then we ended up here back on the gravel road, which is fine in all reality. But and then more recently, we had another full-time guy for a while, and then more recently just decided, it's time to get back to the roots of why we started it to begin with, and that's as a family business. And so it's just my family and I, and we homeschool, and so we're pretty flexible with how our schedule works, and the kids are able to help and learn about business and the trades, and working with their hands, and maybe deciding that they don't want to do hard work, when they grow up, and that's fine. But and that's just been the first of the year, this year, that we've made that change. And so right now it's a small family operation based out of our house. And that's how I see it for the foreseeable future, unless one of the kids wants to take it over someday. And
absolutely. Honestly, running a business is one of the hardest things, and hiring, out of all the things you have to do as an entrepreneur, is like the hardest thing. To find somebody who's going to share your values, going to have the same work ethic as you do, someone who's able to just like take initiative and not need too much hand holding along the way. There's so many things that go into it. And like you said, culture in a business is really important. And when it's good, it's amazing. And when it's not, it's like really not, and it affects everything. So it's such a tricky thing. But I'm glad that you guys have kind of found the groove that you want to be in. Being a family business is amazing, and being able to involve your kids in it as well, I'm sure, is really fulfilling. Talk me through your workflows before you found ArcSite. What was the typical process looking like when you guys were looking to start up on a new job?
Okay, so before ArcSite, I had my stone tablet and my chisel and hammer, metaphorically speaking. So when I first started, it was all just, scratch paper, from the fence suppliers. They had these little, they'll be this big or big pads, this big grid paper, and a lot of guys still use that. They'll have company branded sheets like that, and they go on the job site and they measure, and they just, each little square is 8 feet or 10 feet, whatever the sections are, and they'll draw it out with how many corners and how many gates, and do a quote right there, handwritten. And that's kind of how I started out on the drawing side of things. But then I've always been big on spreadsheets, all through my oil field days as well. And so it didn't take long to come up with a kind of automatic cost calculator that just had a list of all the things that I use for different styles of fence. And then I would just put in the quantities that I need based on my little hand drawing. And then it would let me put in the labor, and it would automatically calculate the totals that I need. And then I graduated from the pen and paper to a spreadsheet that I made, that I put in the lengths of each run, how many corners and ends, and then it would do those calculations that I was doing on paper for me. But then fast forward to, I think, September of 2021, when ArcSite was just getting started with fence. And I feel like I was really on the ground floor of that, and was able to help ArcSite as a whole understand fence, which was really cool to be a part of that process. But I saw a lot of potential in that, here's this big sandbox that I can do whatever I want. I can price things by the foot, which I don't like to do. But in a pinch, it works. And then, I can also build this thing so, to such a granular level that I can make it 100% accurate down to the nuts and bolts, even account for waste on material such as wood. And that's how I built my library from the beginning. And it took a long time. I don't know how many hundreds of hours that I have invested in building that library. And I know that's been kind of a challenge for a lot of fence companies getting into ArcSite, as they see that immense amount of back end work that has to be done up front. And what's really cool is now, almost 5 years in, getting to help ArcSite, move to the next level of things where that back end setup time is very minimal. And so I'm honored to have been a part of that from the very beginning and getting to see what it's becoming. And so I think part of the question was where am I at now with it, or was it just where did I start?
Yeah, we can move into where you are at now. That was perfect. But yeah, tell me about your workflow today with ArcSite. What does that look like?
Okay, so my workflow today with ArcSite it's very in depth. And so I'm pulling data from a few different places. I like to give customers a drawing overlaid on a satellite view of their property. And so I'm pulling the best aerial view I can find into ArcSite and calibrating it to the software. And then I'm drawing the lines exactly as we've measured them on site, or based on what I can see from that satellite view. And it just helps us get on the same page even before walking onto the property. A lot of times, I'd say 80 to 85% of the time, I'm able to give them a pretty firm estimate without having shaken their hand or walked onto their property, which is huge, because a lot of these projects, we're in rural Southeast Kansas. And for me to drive 60 miles, even 40 miles one way, and then spend 30 to 45 minutes or even an hour, depending on how much they like to talk, looking at this project, that can quickly become half a day, just going to look at projects. And so, another element to that is the integration that you guys have with My Salesman. And, it's a more customer-facing lead qualification tool that's on our website. It's something that we've used since the very early days. I think our company was only 2 months old when we signed up for My Salesman. And so that's saved us a lot of time driving to all these potential job sites as well. But now with that integration, I can have a customer run through the quote tool or My Salesman on their own, and then I can import that data directly into ArcSite and double check the measurements with a different software that shows property lines, things like that. And I can get within a few feet of accuracy every single time. And and even if I'm a couple feet short, I still don't have that expense of having to drive, all the way to their property. So that's well worth it to me. And so then another aspect to it is I can quickly change between different styles and heights and even configurations. Once I do the initial layout, I can adjust things pretty quickly and give customers tons of different options right up front with very minimal effort, where it used to be, running through that spreadsheet and doing all these different drawings and figuring out section counts and post counts and things like that. So then, I may even text that drawing, a screenshot of that drawing to them. And I always highlight the measurements and the lines in a bright green, so it's highly visible. And another aspect to having that drawing for them is accountability. We're on the same page. You know what I'm proposing. If you want to go out there and measure it yourself just to double check, that's great. At least I'm not showing up with, too much material or not enough because we weren't on the same page from the very beginning. A lot of contractors would just say, I'm going to install 150 feet of fence, and then you show up and what if they actually expected you to install 175 because you didn't, you made a mistake on the layout. And so, and it's just, if I'm competing against another company, there's very few companies, especially around here, that are presenting estimates to customers in this professional of a manner, with a proper drawing and detailing exactly what they're going to do and when they're going to do it and how much it's going to cost. And so it's not uncommon for us to be the high price, but still get the job because of the level of professionalism that we bring to the table. And ArcSite is a huge part of that.
Amazing. That's really good to hear. And I think, like you just said, like it is, every business needs to be competitive in how they're like presenting their estimates and proposals to their customers to win the bid. And ultimately it's that customer's hard-earned dollars, right? And they want to be sure that they're trusting their money to somebody who's going to do a really great job and really have that like work ethic that you mentioned earlier as well. And I think it's just allowing companies like yourself to have that little layer of polish so that you're presenting in the best way initially when you're speaking to those customers. I guess on that, like, have you had any like great customer anecdotes, like maybe one or two stories that stick out when you were able to like present something and they just had a good reaction to looking at it?
Yeah, so we've had several customers who've commented on the quality of the drawings that we're able to provide and the level of detail with it. And even customers who are having a hard time deciding exactly what they want, being able to quickly change styles or heights or colors and to give them those options. When I'm not giving a firm estimate, but I'm, just helping to set a ballpark price for 5 or 10 different options sometimes. People will be apologizing for taking so much time, but in reality, with ArcSite, it doesn't take that much time to show different options. And so I just tell them, hey, it's part of it. It's what I'm here for. This is a big investment for your property, and I want to make sure that you're getting what you want. And they'll even ask, well, what's your opinion? My opinion really doesn't matter, because I don't have to look at it for the next 20 to 40 years or whatever. But I want to make sure that you're getting what's appropriate for your property, your goals, and your budget. And so I don't mind doing 10 different options because it really doesn't take that much time. And they appreciate that level of care and detail in showing them tons of different drawings and lots of different prices and just working through those things. So it's helped us win a lot of projects from that standpoint, for sure.
I want to circle back to something you said earlier, just in terms of like material calculations. And, if you come in prepared to install 150 foot worth of fence, and now you might need 175. How has ArcSite helped in just estimating you've got the right amount of materials, you're billing for the right amount, and just making sure that, your margins are not getting impacted when there are those little like variations when you get on site?
Yeah, so ArcSite helps from the standpoint of accuracy in that when I adjust that 100-foot line, or let's say 96-foot line for 8-foot sections, if I go to 97 feet, it knows that it needs to add a section and, that they're going to be spaced out equally. And so it's very, very down to the nuts and bolts in the way that it's built out. And so, it's really quick to make those minor changes that ultimately affect the amount of material that you're going to use on site. even now, just, I print a pull sheet basically that I put on a clipboard, and I take it out to the shop and into the yard and just check things off as we load them. And it just helps us be really detailed in making sure that we have everything that we need as we go to the job site.
Absolutely. One of the things you said earlier as well is that, you were kind of on the ground floor to help ArcSite kind of build its offering around fencing. Initially, I guess, what was that collaboration like for you? We always like to say that we, want to partner with our customers, make sure that we're servicing all of the needs that they have. And like you said as well, where it started out in 2021 is a lot different to where it is now in 2026. But yeah, I guess in general, what has your experience been like working with the ArcSite team?
So my experience working with the ArcSite team has been very pleasant from day one. Patrick Caldwell was my original CS rep. Developed some really good relationships with those guys. And I could tell even from the beginning that, Patrick had a strong desire to see ArcSite become a titan in the fence estimating world. And I've since seen ArcSite far surpass other softwares in this space, and you can tell just from the top down that everybody involved just wants to see this thing be as big, or make as big of an impact for his customers as possible.
Absolutely. If I had to ask you to put a dollar value on the impact ArcSite has had on your business, what would you say?
If I had to put a dollar value on the impact that ArcSite has had on my business, I don't, that's such a hard question. $10 billion. I don't know, because it's like, how many trips to, an hour away have I saved? How many estimates, how many projects have I won by having that more professional proposal? How many bullets have I dodged by, providing such a high level of detail, in that if I had to put a dollar amount on the value that ArcSite has provided to me in the almost 5 years that I've been using it, it's pretty priceless.
Beautiful. I guess sort of looking back on your entrepreneurial journey, like you said, you kind of started out in oil and gas, and this is sort of a redirection that you found yourself in. What has been like the biggest piece of advice that you would give yourself if you could teleport back 10 years and advise your past self?
If I could go back 10 years and give myself a piece of advice, it would be not to compare myself to other business owners, other entrepreneurs, because it's really easy to see others' success, to see their 10 trucks, their 10 crews and their giant warehouse and their massive online presence, videos with millions of views, and to be envious of that. But and I've spent the last few years cutting out a lot of that noise. I call it, and just keeping my head down and worrying about what I have to do each day, and the victories and the goals that are in front of me. And my life is not theirs, and vice versa. And my joy is not to be a multi-million-dollar company. I tried for a little bit, and it backfired, and it wasn't fun. And I really didn't enjoy any part of that process. And so I found the most joy in where we're at right now, honestly. And so that's what I would say. Just don't compare yourself to others.
Absolutely. They say comparison is the thief of joy, and it is so true. And it's too easy to compare yourself these days. Like, you open up your phone on Instagram, TikTok, whatever, and you see 1,000 people living amazing, successful lives. But A, how much of that is real? Because people always post like the shiniest parts of their life and their success. And then B, it's about what makes you happy, I think is a lot harder question to answer. Because sure, anybody might be happy as a founder of a multi-million-dollar business, but is that the right thing for everyone, right? Like, I know I wouldn't want to do that. I like having my work-life balance. I like being able to spend time with my family. I like being able to do a really good job at my job, but then it's all about, having that holistic aspect to your life. And if you don't have that, then, you're probably not a very happy camper.
Yeah. I've even had in recent months, since making these changes, I've had some pretty candid conversations with other business owners who are chasing, the big dream and have, tens or I don't know, maybe 100 people on payroll, people that they're responsible for their livelihoods. And that's a wonderful thing, if it's managed correctly, but they've even shared some, burnout.
And managing people is really hard. Like, yeah. I think everybody, I don't know, imagines like, oh, it's great to be the boss here. You got a whole team under you, all this stuff. But I don't know. I found that like being a people manager is almost like being a glorified therapist. Like, there's a lot of problems that you have to deal with all the time. People want a certain type of answer. Sometimes they just want to vent. And I don't think a lot of people realize that until you get into that role and you're like, wait a minute, this is not the kick back in my chair boss role that I thought it would be. It's actually a lot of hard work, minutia, and like emotional stress as well, because you're having to deal with people's emotions as they bring stuff to you. So I guess looking forward now as well, where do you hope that your business might grow in the next 5 to 10 years?
So in the next 5 to 10 years, I hope to see our business grow into leaning pretty heavily on the family aspect of things. I've got my kids are 16, 15, and 13. And my son's right in the middle. He's the 15-year-old. And he started to help more in the field here lately and is taking an interest to it. And just trying to nurture those relationships with my kids and see if one of them maybe wants to take it over in time and really no plans to scale or to chase the multiple crews and things like that anymore. Just want to be where we're at for a while.
Absolutely. And also, I think it just, kind of plays to the fact that you are such a, important member of your community, right? And I think especially for where you're at in Southeast Kansas, I'm sure people are looking for other members of the community to like invest their hard-earned dollars into. Like, I know that when I look for, if I need someone to do work around my house or my property, I always want to go for a smaller business because sure, I might be able to find the big business with the shiny website and the bells and whistles and all that stuff. But honestly, the smaller the business, the better care you're going to get, the more attention to detail you're going to get. There's just a lot more heart and soul that's put into it. So I think it's very clear that you're filling that niche, especially in your community there.
Yeah, and I would say to anyone out there who is being told that they have to stick with the cheaper material because nobody's going to pay for the good stuff, or just lies like that. If you focus on building a good reputation and a quality, a brand that's centered on quality and good customer service, there's people in every market who are willing to pay for that. And it's up to you to be the market disruptor, so to speak, and people appreciate that. There's a lot of customers who we get through word of mouth or even organically through our website who they don't shop around because they see what else is out there and they see that there's something different about us, even though we may be higher than others. But it's just more often than not, we're not competing against another company. We're really just competing against our own values and reputation and a level of quality that we say we're going to provide.
Speaking of reputation, though, how did you guys get to build your reputation? I know that's a loaded question, but I guess thinking about maybe a younger fence company that might be coming up, somebody who might be venturing to start their own business, what advice would you give to them on building their reputation around their values and their work ethic?
So the key to building your reputation as a new fence company is consistency. Do what you say you're going to do when you say you're going to do it, and maintain a level of quality that means doing the right thing when they're not watching. You know, when you need to make a decision that would save you a little bit of money, but it would cheapen their product, their end result. You know, making the right decision every time, earning their trust, and that has a snowball effect over time.
Absolutely. Nothing earns a customer's trust by just knowing that the business did right by you. You know, people notice that, and they always were gonna, come back, recommend you to their, peers or friends or family or whatever it is. And that's really priceless. Like, you can't put a price on trust.
For sure.
I've got my last two questions for you now. The first of which is, what is your favorite thing about being an entrepreneur?
So my favorite thing about being an entrepreneur is the flexibility. I can choose, especially in this season where it's really just our family. And we homeschool as well. So our kids are playing sports with a homeschool sports program. So we may need to go on a Tuesday afternoon to Manhattan, 2.5 hours away for a tournament. So being able to schedule work around those things without worrying about, taking too many vacation days and losing my job. So that's been the biggest benefit, is just the flexibility of it.
Definitely. And my last question for you then is, how do you define success?
I think success is having a quality of life that includes having good relationships with those around you, especially your family, your inner circle, and being good to, a good leader and a good friend to those outside of even that circle, but also realizing that you don't have to keep up with those who are more successful. You don't have to chase money and power and things like that, but just stay in your lane and just find joy in what you're doing.